Okay, fantastic. Ed, you all set up?
I am indeed. How are you doing today, Will?
Really well, thanks. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you for asking.
Brilliant. All right, let's get started. Thanks everyone for your patience. Sorry we're starting a little later than planned. Welcome to this week's UniAdmissions Open Day. My name is Will. I'm the head of the consulting team at UniAdmissions. So, it's my job to make sure that when students get in touch with us, we've got people there who are able to, help them answer questions, sort things out for them. And I'm joined this week by Ed. Ed, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Thank you very much, Will. So my name is Ed or Edward, whichever one you prefer, and I am one of the admission consultants here at UniAdmissions. So if you are interested in potentially joining one of our programs, then feel free to get in touch, and you'd be speaking to either myself or a member of the team. That's pretty much it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. But yeah, like Ed says, if you are a student who's already been on the website or a parent who's sort of wanting to find out a bit more about the application process or about interviews specifically, it'd be Ed or one of the team that you speak to, and they're there to make sure that you've got all the information you need, you've got all the advice and guidance you need. All right, let's get cracking. So this week we are talking about interviews. We're talking about Oxbridge interviews, and what we've done is we've sort of separated out some key things that we think students should be aware of, should know about when they are preparing for their interviews. Normally, we've got Matt Elliott, our head of research here, co-presenting as well, but he can't make it. So he's very sorry. He wishes he was here, but I'm sure he'll be joining us back on next week. Next week, we're talking specifically about MMIs. So I imagine some of you watching right now are planning on applying for medicine, but a lot of you won't be. If you're not applying for medicine, then next week's open day won't be as relevant for you, but stay tuned to see what other topics come up. If you are interested in medicine, if you have applied for medicine, then next week's will also be a really good open day for you to come to. We're hoping we'll be able to give you some practice MMI stations as well, so you can even have a go and see how you find it. So that should hopefully be a really good open day. But before we get ahead of ourselves, before we get on to next week, let's talk about this week. So, like I say, Matt and I have broken down some key things that we think students really should be thinking about when they are preparing for their interviews. It's worth saying there is a Q&A function, which hopefully you can all access. We will get through questions at the end. So if you think, oh, he's not seen my question, it's not that. I am actively ignoring you, but we will, I promise, get to it at the end. We'll be able to go through loads and loads of things. So if you think of something that you want to ask, pop it in the Q&A, because it might be that by the time we get round to it, you'll have forgotten. So just pop it there and we will get round to it, and Ed and I will sort of answer anything and everything that we can. Okay, so step one. This might seem quite obvious, but it's an important thing to just get done and make sure that you've got in your back pocket. So know your personal statements. You'll have all submitted your personal statements, sort of depending on when your school wanted it in, maybe at start of October, maybe, 14th of October if you're doing it quite last minute. But that might have been the last time you've looked at your personal statement. Try and make sure that before your interviews, you are refreshing yourself, because that's 2 months plus. We can't expect you to remember absolutely everything. Just make sure you're familiar with it. So, think about all the different things that you talked about. Why did you talk about particular books that you've talked about reading? Why did you talk about particular experiences, particular volunteering that you've done? What was it that you were wanting to put across in talking about those things? And make sure that you're aware of that, because you can then talk about that if it's brought up at interview. Okay. Now, when it comes to an Oxford or Cambridge interview, ultimately, if they do ask, they might not ask you about your personal statement at all, right? It might not come up at all. But if they do ask, you want to make sure it doesn't take you off guard. It's something that you have total control over. Definitely practice talking about things on your personal statement, but don't prepare canned responses or anything like that. Ed, thoughts on sort of rote learning particular lines that you want to put in the interview? Good idea?
I wouldn't do that. It's not a good idea. I think most interviewers and admissions tutors would have interviewed plenty of students in their time. So I would expect that a lot of them can see right through the smoke and mirrors. So definitely don't memorize and rehearse your answers perfectly, and try to come across as natural as you possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think often when we talk about preparing for interviews, students misunderstand that and think that means preparing answers. It's more about making sure that you, particularly with knowing your personal statement, you're totally aware of everything you've talked about. You've got ideas about it fresh in your mind. And again, that is something which can be practiced. You know, you can practice that, provided you supply your personal statement to someone. And again, it might not come up. So in my Oxford interview, it did come up. And I, in my eternal wisdom, hadn't read my personal statement recently. So it did kind of take me off guard. Luckily, it was something which they asked me questions about things which I had been doing recently, so it was still fresh in my mind, but they could have very easily asked me about a book that I hadn't read for a few months, and I would have been pretty unstuck at that point. Okay, knowing the mark scheme. And what we mean by this second step is effectively knowing what they are assessing you on, how they are assessing you. Obviously, the Oxbridge interviews have this reputation of being sort of quite nebulous, quite ununderstandable. You know, you just kind of go and they decide if they like you or not. That's not the case. It is structured. They do have guidelines. They have sort of rules that your admissions tutor is going to be looking at. You know, they are really meticulous with making sure this is as standardized as possible. Interviews can never be fully standardized, but they want to try and make sure that everyone is being assessed in as fair a way as possible. And so if you know that that's the case, if you know you're being assessed in a particular way, then you can obviously be aware of what you need to be working on. It's worth bearing in mind that you'll have quite a few interviews. So don't just, you know, prepare for a couple of interview questions. Across 2 or 3+ interviews, there could be loads of different things that you talk about. So you want to expose yourself to as many mock interview scenarios as possible. You know, it is meant to be difficult. Don't shy away from difficult questions. Don't be afraid of them. Practice them. And yeah, make sure that that's part of your preparation. And when we talk about the assessment side of things, these are taken directly from the guidelines. It's for Oxford PPE, the guidelines given to Oxford PPE admissions tutors for how to assess their students who are interviewing with them. So these are key things that you can sort of spend some time on. You've got a month now, basically, until your interviews. It's time to really throw yourself into your subject. So they're looking for people who are applied. They're looking for people who are enthusiastic about their subject. They are interested. When you ask them a question about it, they don't see that question as a chore. You see that question as an opportunity to explore something interesting. So really throw yourself into your subject, throw yourself into potentially areas that you're less familiar with, so it's something new, but something that you find interesting. And of course, getting used to exploring new ideas in an area you find interesting is something which is very relevant to the interviews. In terms of the reasoning, you know, this is much more important than your ability to just know a lot of stuff. They are not looking for people who have memorized lots and lots of facts. They're looking for people who can approach new scenarios, new questions, and explore them in a reasonable way and in a logical way, and really be able to show your working while you're doing it. And being able to break free of unproductive thinking is a really important thing. You know, you could get asked a question by your interviewer, and if you're unsure what kind of questions can come up, we did an open day last week, which might be worth you finding on YouTube. But if you're asked a question and you start working your way through it, and you realize actually what I'm sort of the conclusion that I'm working my way towards doesn't make sense because I've made an assumption that isn't right, If you just carry on and sort of double down and stick with that conclusion, that is unproductive thinking. For you to say, actually, you know what, I've realized my initial assumption was wrong, that changes things. That is the kind of thing that they're looking for. And that's relevant to one of the points that we talk about later. And of course, communication, they need to be able to understand what you're talking about. You need to be able to express your thoughts and ideas, particularly for people who are doing STEM subjects. That's probably something you don't normally have to explain yourself verbally, right? You normally are doing it with a pen and paper. So this is a very different modality that you're used to. And so it's important that you get yourself used to it. That's really, really key. Okay. Ed, anything you wanted to add about, you know, the sort of understanding how you're being assessed?
I mean, Will, you've done like an excellent job
Well, thank you.
covering virtually everything. If there is one thing I could add is try to remain calm, because essentially the admissions tutors are not trying to catch you out. They're really trying to understand how you think. So really, really do try and remain calm and express your thoughts and everything that's going through your head as clearly and as confidently and as calmly as you possibly can.
Yeah, you know, really good advice. Obviously, it's so difficult. It's easy to say and difficult to do. And that's where the practice comes in. You know, that pressure that comes with an Oxbridge interview, that you can't really practice for. But if you can practice everything else, if you can get ready for every other side of what's going to happen at that interview, then all you've got to handle is that extra pressure. And that's a lot less on your plate, and you can stay calm, like Ed's saying. Okay, fantastic. So step 3, and it's quite important to be introspective here. It's important to know what you're strong at and what you're less strong at. And it's really important to get feedback from other people about that as well. So, you know, Oxford and Cambridge are looking for people with soft skills, with the ability, not just the academic skills, not just the technical understanding, but the ability to also explain things, to convey things, and also to make connections across, you know, different concepts. And part of the metacognition, sort of the awareness of your own cognition, is one of those things relevant to that, being able to come away from an unproductive line of thinking. So, you know, if you're someone who is strong across the board in terms of these soft skills, that's great. That's something to practice and keep working on. But if you know that actually when you try to explain complicated things to people, it sometimes takes longer than you're expecting, if you know that there are particular things that you struggle with, or if people have said that to you in the past, I've certainly been told at times that I'm not very good at explaining certain things. And then when you have that feedback, what you need to be able to do is work on that. So how can I be better at getting my point across? How can I be better at expressing what I'm trying to express? And of course, then if you're able to do that, they're then able to, like Ed says, assess your ability. And yeah, you know, you might be someone who's quite a visual thinker. If you need that to be able to work through problems, then why not have a piece of paper and a pen on your desk next to you in case there's something which you need to physically diagram out? Of course, you can talk about it as you're doing it, but you know, that is, if you know that's going to be seriously helpful for you, then that is something to consider having by your side. You know, it's really, if you can understand your strengths and weaknesses, or if you can get feedback from other people about your strengths and weaknesses, then that gives you a really clear sense of where to work on. Okay, and step 4 is practice. Now, we've talked about this already, but it can't be stressed enough. You know, you're going to have minimum, well, some people will have 1 interview, very few people will. Most people are going to have minimum 2 interviews, if not more. And at those interviews, you're probably going to have 2 interviewers. So you're going to have lots of different people asking you questions about lots of different things. So you need to practice as many scenarios as you can. You really want to get as much experience and practice as possible. Now, Matt is who is often at these, is a big football fan. I didn't understand what this was. He tells me this is a very important penalty in the Euros last year, in the Euro finals. Ed obviously knows what Matt is talking about. But the point of this is, you know, if you think about this penalty, this is kind of elite level sports at the highest level it gets. The person taking the penalty and the keeper, neither of them is this their first time having to go at a penalty shootout. They will have practiced and practiced and practiced. What I think is important to think about when it comes to an Oxford and Cambridge interview is it's not sports, but it is one of the most elite level academic tests or challenges that you will ever go through. So to have the attitude of just thinking, well, I'll just show up and, you know, they'll ask me questions and it will go okay, hopefully. You know, if either of those footballers said that to their coaches would have said, well, you're not playing that game because I need someone who can either score a penalty or can save one. And so if you approach it in the same way, realize that this is definitely something that needs practice, definitely something that you can work on. You know, for most students, some of you might have had interviews for your school, but that will have been a very different interview. And if that is your only interview experience, then you've not had that much experience so far. So you really need to make sure that you're able to get that practice. It's absolutely normal to, when you do your first mock interview, for it to not go very well. Okay. And that shouldn't be something which knocks your confidence. That should actually be something which is useful because it shows you all the things that you can improve on. Okay. You might want to avoid a mock interview because you might think it's going to go badly, but you want to get over that hurdle. You want to get over that hump, and then you can start working on things. Practicing with a wide range of people is really important. You know, your two different interviews, my two different interviews at Oxford, they were very different. We covered very different things. And so if I'd only prepared for like one kind of interview, I would have put myself into a bit of a corner there. And so if you're practicing with people who, you know, different people who had different interviews at different colleges, then you're getting a wealth of experience. And Ed will talk a bit about, you know, how we approach that in our support later. And yeah, practice being in uncomfortable positions, practice getting it wrong, practice not knowing the answer. Hopefully school will do something to help. Not all schools can, not all schools do. Sometimes the help of schools is quite variable. Make the most of the help that you can get at school, but get help wherever you can. You know, really explore all possible avenues. You can never have enough, you can never prepare enough for something like this. And again, when I say prepare, it's not about learning cam responses. It's about experiencing mock interview scenarios. It's about exploring unknown topics within your subject and, you know, tackling tricky questions. Step 5. So I know that this causes Matt some serious angst, but interviews are still online for some reason. Medics, you know, non-Oxbridge, less so the case, but Oxford and Cambridge, they're still doing their interviews online. So actually, you have a lot of control over the environment that you sit your interview in. Yes, it's not ideal. You know, yes, it would be better if you could be there in person. You know, you could speak to them, you could sort of engage with them more in person. But what you want to do is make the most of your advantages of being online. Okay. Just give me. My fiance's just returned home and didn't know that I was presenting. You have control over your environment. Make sure you've got a desk which is tidy and is not distracting. Make sure everyone in your household knows that you're doing an interview, so no one walks in making any noise. Make sure you've got a quiet environment. If school can do it, if they can offer you a quiet room, then take that. Make sure your, you know, Wi-Fi connection, all that kind of stuff is perfect. And like I said, if you're the kind of person that could really do with a pen and paper, then have it there. You might not use it, but better to have it and not need it than really wish you had it. So quite a few different things to think about. Obviously, it's important to have an idea of what you're being assessed on. It's important to be preparing in the right way and in a way that prepares you. So if your school offers you a mock interview, say, can we do that online? Can we do that virtually so that your mock interviews are similar to the real thing? But some final things just to sort of recap through. Again, make sure you've read your personal statement and make sure everything that you've said on your personal statement is correct. I shouldn't have to tell people this, but if you've said you've read a book on your personal statement that you haven't read, get reading, make sure you have. You really don't want that to come up during the interview if you haven't. Show off where you can. If it's a topic that you're interested in, then you can demonstrate your interest by talking about the things that you've been reading, bringing that into the discussion that you're having. Like Ed says, stay calm, take pauses, don't feel like you have to answer a question immediately. Have a glass of water or a glass and a jug of water by your side so you can drink, and you can use that as a way to help calm yourself down. So if you're getting very stressed, just grab your glass of water, take a drink, pause, get back to it. Don't make stuff up. Matt says that in a bit of a more fruity way. They will know if you are making stuff up. These guys are world leading experts often in the stuff that you'll be talking about. So they're not looking for someone who knows as much as them. They're looking for someone who they can work with, they can teach, and they can develop ideas with. So yeah, really do make sure that you're not that you're there and you're demonstrating your teachability. Okay, so that is quite a lot of different things to be thinking about. Some of these things I imagine some of you will have already thought about and spent some time on, but hopefully there are a couple of things here which maybe you hadn't fully considered before, and it's worth over the next few weeks incorporating that into your plan for preparing for this. Of course, everyone prepares for their interviews in different ways. And over the years, we've developed our own approach to helping students make the most of their interviews. And Ed is here because he knows how we help students as better than anyone else. So Ed, it's your turn now to take them through the kind of things. And again, everyone deserves a different approach, but these are the kind of things that we can be doing to help you.
Sure. Thank you for that presentation, Will. That's really, really useful. I guess, what can we offer here at UniAdmissions? Well, as you can see from the slide, we've got our premium programs, which will, of course, be subject specific. Now, there's 4 main pillars to all of our programs. So the first thing, you would have a certain amount of one-to-one sessions with all of our expert tutors. So all of our tutors will, of course, be specific to your subjects. And one thing which is very much unique to UniAdmissions is that, particularly for your interviews, you'll have the chance to practice and gain feedback and gain different perspectives from multiple tutors. And the reason we do that is because the number one thing we fear the most is for you to get really comfortable talking about your subject with your main tutor. However, when you actually end up walking into the interview room, it turns out that the Oxbridge, interviewer is someone of a completely different personality, which is why we want to make sure that you have the chance to learn and gain different perspectives and different ways of talking about your subjects. Okay. So yes, your tutors will essentially be in charge of overseeing your development throughout the program. And the second thing, pillar number 2, is that you will have full access to our library of resources, books, academy videos, past papers, and everything you're going to need to practice and prepare. Okay, now these resources will essentially help you carry out the homework, which will be set by your tutors from a session to session basis. Okay, we would advise that you access the portal at the very least 3 to 4 times per week in order to make sure that you are up to date with the latest updates regarding the application season. Now, the third pillar is that every Sunday at 2 p.m. we run subject-specific enrichment seminars. All right. Now, you can think of these as university level lectures, and these will give you the opportunity to dive into a little bit more depth of your subject, and it will help you understand your motivations and the genuine passion which you have for your subject, and helping you sort of formulate that and convey that in an interview as well as in your personal statement, which is exactly what Oxbridge will be looking for you to do. Now, the final pillar is the day intensive courses. Okay, now we will be having an intensive course for each one of the application hurdles. So there's going to be an intensive course for the personal statements, an intensive course for your entrance exam, and an intensive course for your interviews, right? Now, essentially, these are sort of the final hurdle, and it's a way for you to go into the interview room with the confidence and the knowledge that you've done everything in your power to be ready. Okay, so you can think of this as the final hurdle of the program. And that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Thanks. And yeah, like I said, obviously some of you might be thinking about applying next year. Some of you will be applying for this year. And of course, all those different things that we do, it'll be a case of having a chat with Ed or one of the team and really tailoring it to what you need in terms of your preparation. So yeah, if you're ever thinking, actually, I don't think school will be able to help me enough, or I don't think my plan is going to prepare me well enough, it's always worth having a chat with us and seeing if there's something we can do that fits in and helps support you. Obviously, you know, lots of different schools perform in different ways. And just because you go to a school that has good A-level results or good GCSE results doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to do that much support for Oxford or Cambridge. So these are some of the top performing schools in the country, but you can see there's a big variation in terms of what they can achieve. Now, you know, over the last few years, we've been able to get over 60% of our students offers to Oxford and Cambridge. So, you know, we do put a lot of effort in, and the result of that is really good outcomes. But if you want to know a bit more about, well, how has my school done in the past? How have students from my school done in the past? You can get this information from Oxford, you can get it from Cambridge, or you can have a chat with the school. You know, you can ask them, talk about it, and see what they can do to help you. Really, really important. You know, some schools will have it already set up and you'll already know. Some schools might not even talk about it unless you bring it up. So please do have a chat with head of sixth form, head of careers, whoever it is that might be relevant. And if it's not, you know, if you're not happy with it, then obviously you can come and chat with us and we can see if there's something we can do. And, you know, ultimately, if you are one of our students, or if the only way you engage with us is through coming to these open days, we would really love to hear from you. You know, whether you interact with us on a small or a deep level, we want to know if what we're doing is helpful and beneficial. And all feedback is really, really helpful, because we can then improve what we're doing for future students and make a difference that way. So yeah, if you have time, do leave a review after this. If you get the opportunity to speak with Ed, then, you know, let us know how fantastic and knowledgeable he is. And if you are one of our students, we're always going to be trying to, you know, touch base with you, understand how it's working, understand how you're developing through the application process. One more thing to mention, as we often do, these open days, we do them so we can get as much information out there to the people who need it. Rohan and I also make a podcast. In that podcast, we talk about quite a lot of different things, but we also talk a lot about university applications and also life at Oxford or Cambridge. So, you know, if it's something that, if there are things that you feel like there are gaps in your knowledge, please do come to other open days, or please do check out the podcast. There may be a few topics that we can talk about that can help, you know, demystify certain things. Okay, fantastic. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through questions and answers. So if you do have more questions, do send them through. If you do want to speak to any of us, you know, more one-to-one, and we can go through your specific scenario and circumstances in more detail, then basically use this link below. at the bottom, and this little GIF is kind of showing you how you book a consultation with one of us. But while that's running, we are going to go through the Q&A. Okay, so someone has asked, when can we expect invitations to be sent out? So it's difficult to say with certainty. What you normally see, or what Oxford and Cambridge normally give you, and this is an averaging, but about 5 to 10 days notice. Okay, so that's obviously quite late. And you know, what you don't want to do is be waiting and waiting and waiting, and then they say you've got an interview, and then, you know, 5 days later you've got to do it and you haven't done any preparation. So really do make sure that, you know, you are preparing well in advance of that. Hopefully you get asked with more notice, but just based on experience, that is what can happen sometimes. Okay. We have got a question saying, most Oxford interviews now involve unseen texts. What is the best way to prepare for this? Do you have real examples of past unseen texts you can use for mock interviews? So based on my experience, one of the interviews was where I was given a research paper to read for 30 minutes before the interview itself. And I think they'd sort of redacted the conclusions and the abstracts, because that kind of gives everything away. So you've just got, I guess, the meat of the article, and you have to then interpret things from it. The best way to prepare for that would be to, you know, research articles, get some from school, ask a teacher to provide some, and you can prepare going against unseen material. Equally, that is something that we do with our students, you know, making sure that they're used to having to handle that kind of thing. It can be quite intimidating, you know, you just get given this thing and you have to interpret it, and then suddenly you're in an interview about it. But practicing is just the best way to do it. And again, either if school is helping you, then they will probably be able to provide some stuff for you. And if you don't have that from school, then that is always something that we can help. Ed, someone has asked if we mentioned some online courses or books but haven't finished it completely, or only done a small portion of it, is that okay? So what should someone do if they've only somewhat read a book that they've talked about, or partially finished an online course?
Sure. I mean, that's a good question. It really does depend on the reason why you are mentioning that book specifically. What is the point of that you're trying to get across, right? I mean, for example, if you were to mention that you've read a specific book because you found that the introduction had quite a lot of information which has helped you in some sort of manner, then I can imagine that it's fine leaving it on, as long as you express and you explain why that particular section of the book was important to you. I think there's not an issue with that. But conversely, if you were to just have read the first paragraph of a 500-page novel and you were to expect to draw a conclusion from that, you know, you can see how that may not necessarily be a good way forward, right? As it's quite easy for them to catch you out, as it's quite clear that you don't fully understand the message of the book, or what the book is trying to represent. So I think that's the new nuance which I would keep in mind. It's really, why are you trying to, what is the message which you're trying to relay?
Yeah, I think Ed's absolutely right. You know, if you are just, you know, let's take a textbook, for example. You might have read certain parts of a textbook. You don't have to have read everything. If you say you've read everything, then obviously you should probably get on and do that. But if you're talking about a particular bit because that's what interests you, then that's fine, and you'll still be able to discuss it with them if they bring it up. We've got a question here saying, how should you get dressed which I think is a great question. I think ultimately I would encourage you not to worry too much about what you're wearing. They don't really have any, there's no feedback or guidelines from Oxford or Cambridge. So what I would say is dress, smartly, but be comfortable in what you're wearing. What we're trying to, the aim with getting ready for these interviews is to be surprised by as little as possible on the day, to be uncomfortable by as little as possible by whatever's happening on the day. So if you're wearing something which you're not comfortable in, that's gonna, that's not ideal. It's not going to help you perform as well as you can. But I would wear something smart. So my interviews were in person. I think I wore a sort of a shirt and jeans, or a shirt and chinos, something along those lines. There were the PPE lot were all in suits and ties. I don't know if that's entirely necessary. Everyone who wasn't doing PPE thought they were a bit weird, but could understand that was kind of their subject is a bit more that way. But ultimately, you're not going to be rejected because of what you wore. You'll be rejected if you weren't a strong enough candidate. Equally, you won't be accepted because you dress particularly stylishly. You'll be accepted because you're the best candidate. Now, they want you to look like you're taking it seriously, so don't be in your pajamas. But you still want to be able to perform as well as you can. So wear something which isn't horribly uncomfortable. Okay. There's a great question here. Will I be asked about the admissions test in the interview? So this is, it depends a bit on your subject. I would say if your admissions test was purely a multiple choice admissions test, it's really unlikely that your responses to a question is going to come up. If you sat the TSA, for example, and you wrote an essay, it's possible that they might look at your essay and ask you about it. So one of the things that we often say to students is, when you do the TSA, which some of you will have done this week, congratulations, well done. I hope it went well. After you've done the TSA, just jot down the question that you answered and a summary of what you said, because you won't remember in a month's time what you talked about. And again, it's not like they're going to say, well, what was your answer? And they're expecting you to just remember it all. But it's helpful if you can just, similar to the personal statement, if you can just refresh yourself of it. So if there's a written component of your test, it's worth refreshing. I wasn't asked about my TSA. It doesn't come up often, but just in case, there's no harm in knowing what you said. Another question here, is it beneficial to ask a question at the end of the interview when they ask if you have any questions? If so, what sort of question should you ask? My take on this is, don't ask a question for the sake of asking a question. Ask a question if there's something you don't understand about the application process, or about what it's like at Oxford or Cambridge, or maybe a question about something that you've talked about in the interview. So this is interesting, where do you have a book that I could read more about this? Don't ask a question for the sake of it. It is my take, and I don't know, Ed might have something to add as well, but I think, yeah, you want the interview to feel as natural as possible. And if you're kind of thinking in the last 10 minutes, right, what question should I ask? That's going to distract you. Two, if you go into it being like, I'm going to ask this question, that could be totally, and it's like a question to try and show off, that could be totally unrelated to the whole interview and kind of come off as a bit jarring. So if you have a genuine question, ask away. And if you have a genuine question, then it can be about anything. Ed, any contradictory ideas or?
No, I completely agree with you, Will. I think the main takeaway would be that you want the admissions tutors to focus as much as possible on your performance, and anything which will deflect away from that, you just want to remove as much as possible, right? So I think that's the ultimate takeaway from that.
Yeah, awesome. There's a question saying, are we allowed to screenshot anything that they show you for future reference in the interview? I have never been asked this question, and I don't know. I would suspect that they don't want you taking screenshots during the interview. So I would err on the side of jot it down as a note. But yeah, I don't know about that one. I would avoid it just to be on the safe side. I mean, presumably you could do it without them knowing, but I don't know if it really helps that much. Again, Ed, anything to add?
No, I'm completely in unison.
We every time we get a couple of questions which are new to us, which are questions we haven't heard before. So obviously there's always stuff that we can do more homework on. But I'm afraid at the moment I don't know for certain. Let's have a look. Will they ever bring up your written work submission at interview? So if you hear me saying that question, you think I haven't submitted any written work, don't worry, not all subjects have to submit written work. They could, it all depends on what the admissions tutor that you're interviewing with thinks is relevant. So I think someone else asked, how do they choose their questions? Are the questions, so I'm going to link these two questions together. Are the questions they use previously ever reused? Do they have a bank of questions? I'm applying to law at Oxford. The way that certainly my tutor picks questions is, and I know this because I helped him run interviews in my second year and we talked about it. Ultimately, he tries to pick a question which will be about something that he thinks the students won't have covered before. And that's to try and level the playing field. So he doesn't want accidentally, when it's the technical question, when they're talking about sort of more generally your interest in your subject, yes, they want to know about what you're interested in. But with the technical question, they try and make it something which will be new to everyone. So they see equally how everyone handles that. In terms of if they ask about your submitted work, if they present you with a research paper to read before, or an article, or a picture, or whatever it is, it's all kind of down to if the admissions tutor sees that as relevant and helpful for him or her to make a decision. If they feel like actually seeing how this person handles a scientific paper is the best way, I think, to sort of assess someone, then they'll do that. Of course, you don't know that. You don't know that when you apply for your colleges. You don't know that going into the interviews per se. But what I would do if I were you is just be ready for anything. So yeah, make sure you're familiar with your submitted, with the written work that you submitted. Try and refamiliarize yourself with your personal statement and your admissions test essay if you did one. And there are lots of question banks of past questions, but I wouldn't go through those past questions in the hope that one of them will come up again. Because it's possible. Oxbridge interviews have been going for a long time now. It's possible that some questions are similar to previous questions that are asked, but I don't think it's worth trying to, like we said earlier, going through all potential questions and trying to write stock answers. It's good as practice because it gets you to work with material that you're not used to. Okay, interesting question. So will your interviewers be aware of your admissions test results, and would this affect the questions you are asked? They do know about your admissions test results, and they also, for subjects like natural sciences, where you can pick which discipline questions you answer, they will also know what you picked. So if you picked more sort of biology or chemistry or physics, they will know that. And then they will also try and gear their questions a bit more towards what you picked. So just because you picked biology doesn't mean you're only going to be asked biology questions, but it might mean that there's a slightly more biological slant in the overall interview. But, natural sciences is a, by definition, an interdisciplinary subject. So don't just prepare for one branch of sciences. You probably study biology, chemistry, physics. You're probably doing lots of different things. Just keep that up. let's have a look. Okay, there are a few questions here about our support and what it looks like and what it entails and also what it costs. Exactly what it is that we do with each student depends on the students. So if you are interested, do get in touch with us, do book an appointment. We can talk about it, and we'll basically, you know, Ed or one of the team will ask you a load of questions. They really will get a good understanding of how the application's been going so far, how the admissions tests went, what kind of things you've been working on already, what kind of interview support you've had so far, what kind of interview support you'll have going forwards, all that kind of stuff. They build up a really big understanding of you. And from there, they will then recommend what they think is the best tailored program. So it's the best way to get those answers are to speak to us one-to-one, and we can recommend something bespoke. Do you offer courses for history and economics at Oxford? We do support for history and economics at Oxford. It's an interesting one because it's a very small subject, right? I think there's about 14 students each year that do it. So we don't have, we don't have loads and loads of economics in history students just because it's a smaller student cohort, but we normally have a couple each year that we help, with the application process. Ed, any questions that jump out at you? We've got loads of questions, guys. Do keep sending them through. We're going to keep going a bit longer through these questions. If any questions we don't get round to, I do apologize, but we'll try and get through as many of them as we can because you're asking loads of great stuff.
Ooh, I've got one which is a little bit less we haven't really covered. How much time does a typical Oxbridge interview last? Yeah,
okay. So it does vary. But broadly speaking, it's around half an hour. It won't be less than 20 minutes, and it probably won't be more than 40 minutes. So half an hour is quite a good benchmark. Things can run over, they can run under, and I encourage students not to overinterpret based on how long their interview went. So sometimes people will walk out of an interview that was longer than they're expecting, and they think that must have been great. They loved me so much, they just couldn't stop being with me and asking me questions. It might mean that, but it might also mean that they weren't quite impressed to start with, but they wanted to give you a bit more of a go, so they kept going, but sort of still didn't really feel like they were getting anywhere with you. So it could be anything. Equally, if it finishes early, you might think, oh, they hated me. They couldn't even be bothered doing 30 minutes with me. It could also be that actually they'd already gotten a sense of you. They already knew, yeah, this guy's good, or this guy's not good. So don't overinterpret from the length of your interviews. It's always really difficult to know coming out of an interview if it went well or badly. What I try and recommend students is, and yeah, we've got a question about what's an indicator that the interview is going well. What I try and encourage students to do is do the interview and do, however many interviews they give you, and then try and just forget about it. Have a lovely Christmas, enjoy the holidays. You put a lot of work into preparing for the admissions tests, getting your personal statement off early, preparing for interviews. Give yourself a break and try not to overthink about it. In the new year, hopefully you've totally forgotten about Oxford and Cambridge and you just get some really nice news in January. That was how I approached it, and I think that's the best way to approach it in terms of not being disappointed or getting your hopes too high. In terms of what's an indicator that the interview is going well whilst you're in the interview, again, I think it's very difficult for us, as 17-year-old students to have a good sense of that when you are applying and when you're doing your interview. I would say there was one point in one of my interviews where I kind of noticed that one of the interviewers perked up a bit, and we were talking about my interest in a particular field, and I kind of realized that he perked up, and we had a great conversation about it, and we had quite a interesting discussion where we sort of talked about ways that you'd design experiments to sort of ask different questions. I think if you walk out of it feeling like it was like you've been sort of stretched and challenged, that's a good sign. If you walk out of it thinking that was easy, I knew all the answers, you might have misinterpreted the point of the questions. And that's, we talk about that a bit in the open day last week. You know, the kind of questions that they ask, it's not like they don't ask a question and they're waiting for you to just work out a number answer or a name answer or whatever it is. It's more how do you set your parameters? How do you set up your experiments? So yeah, hopefully that's a bit of an answer. But again, the short answer is you can never really know if the interview's gone well or not, particularly if it's an Oxbridge interview. Got a question here. When do you hear back? So Oxford is typically quicker. I think sort of middle of January normally for Oxford, and then kind of end of January for Cambridge is what's happened in previous years. So that's a rough timeline to sort of be aware of. But again, I would encourage you to. It's so easy to say; it's a lot harder to do. But just do the interview and then try and put it behind you and have a really good Christmas. If you expect little, then you normally get happily surprised. Okay. What would you say are the main advantages and disadvantages of having online interviews rather than in-person interviews? Yeah. So for people who have in-person interviews, I think it's easier for you to interact with people in person. Ultimately, the interviews themselves are designed to kind of emulate Cambridge supervisions or Oxford tutorials. So it is meant to be a collaborative work that you're doing with the tutor. It's not a case of tutor asks question, student gives answer, tutor asks next question, student gives answer. There should be more back and forth. Now, I personally think the back and forth is easier in person. But, online, you do have a bit more comfort. You are able to control the setting a bit more. I would say one thing that I meant to say earlier is simple things, like make sure your lighting's good. Make sure your light is in front of you rather than behind you, so you're just washed out and they can actually see you. It's difficult to interact with people online, as I've said already. It's even harder when they can hardly see your face. So simple things like that, be aware of, and definitely practice it. Make it work for you. Don't have it work against you. I personally would always prefer to do them in person, not least because you get to stay in college for a couple of days, which is really nice. So it's a shame for people that don't get that opportunity. But it is what it is. Someone's asked if it's appropriate to email your college to ask about the structure of each of your interviews. For example, for economics, some colleges do one maths interview and one econ interview, but some colleges have a mix of both in both interviews. They will normally give you, when they ask you to interview, you often get, and again, the college it's a decentralized process, right? The college kind of decides, or the admissions tutor kind of decides how they want to do it. But they will typically give you a bit more information about what to expect at that stage. I mean, you can. I don't think it's going to be negative if you're sort of polite about it and you just ask for a bit more information. I don't think you lose anything. I'm not entirely sure they'll tell you anything because ultimately they're not going to tell you something that only you would know. They would want everyone to know kind of the same amount of stuff about what's going to happen at the interview. So if they were going to tell you anything, I imagine they'd do it to everyone who's invited, at which point they'd do it at the point of invitation. But if it makes you happy, you go for it. It's not going to cause any harm. Okay, for law interviews, would you be able to use your notes for any pre-readings that you are given? I'm assuming this means sort of you get given a reading and then you go into the interview. Yeah. So like I said, particularly for those, it would be good to take notes. Someone asked last week if they should bring notes from their wider reading to the interview, and Matt and I kind of said we don't really see the benefit of it, because you don't have no idea what they're going to ask you about in the interview. So if you've got all these notes sort of plastered up on the wall behind you, if anything, it will just be distracting. But if you've been given a specific reading, you know, you've got 30 minutes to read this, then you're joining this Zoom link or whatever it is. Yeah, take notes, have them there, refer to them. That's totally fine. Okay. Can you use pre-written notes? Great question. Again, like I said, I personally can't see the real benefit to it. And if anything, could see it being a little bit distracting. But certainly take notes while you're doing the interview, if that helps. We've answered that one. Will they expect us to fully understand all the material which we have read in books mentioned in the personal statement, especially if we discuss the content from the book in the personal statement? Ed, what do you think? You're muted. Don't accidentally be muted during the whole interview. Top tip.
Yes, definitely don't do that. Forgive me, Will, could you just ask me the question again, please?
Yeah, they're just asking, let's say you've talked about a book on your personal statements. Do you have to fully understand everything to do with that book? Especially if you've talked a bit about the content from the book.
Sure. That's a good question. I think you just have to be able to talk about it confidently, right? Because if it's a book that you're truly interested in and you genuinely find interest in, then you should be able to formulate a rational opinion and be able to back it up with actual evidence which you've developed and gained by reading the book. So yes, in short answer, yes, you should be able to talk about the book in detail.
And I think that, you know, they're interested in your interpretation as well. You know, then they're not looking for, it's not like GCSE where they're kind of like got a little tick box and they're waiting for you to mention this, that's a mark, and then this, that's a mark, and then this, that's a mark. You know, there may be some things about the book that you missed that went over your head. But if you've read it and you've actively engaged with it and you've thought about it, then you will have your own interpretation, and you should be able to talk about that, certainly. So someone has asked, for history, can you be given material beforehand? The answer is you can. You know, and again, it's sort of similar to what I was saying before. It depends a bit on what that admissions tutor wants to do with their interviews, how they feel is the best way to assess a student. But certainly history is a subject where material can be given beforehand. You know, they could quite happily give you a couple of sources to read before the interview, and then you go into the interview. There are also times, guys, when you walk into the interview and whatever the source material is, it's kind of there when you start the interview. So it's not a case of you familiarize yourself with it and then you go into the interview. You don't know what's coming once you walk in there, and then they might present you with something. You know, it might be a picture, it might be a whatever, and they just sort of, you know, work through it with you. And again, if you want to know how to prepare for that, then just practice that. You know, I'm sure there will be, hopefully you have people that you can turn to who will be able to set up scenarios like that for you. There might not be, in which case, you know, you need to try and do the best that you can. For Cambridge, when will invites to interview rejections for medicine be sent out? Given that they look at candidates holistically, if your BMAT is not great, does that mean you have to perform or score better at an interview than someone else with a higher BMAT score? Are both interviews sciencey, or do they ever ask for role play, ethics, NHS knowledge? At Cambridge, the interviews do have a propensity to be more sciencey. Again, that doesn't mean you couldn't be asked about something to do with ethics or the NHS. But you know, it's more likely that it is going to be on the predominantly sciencey side. They do look at, so when will interview and rejections for medicine be sent out? For Cambridge, it's probably going to be end of November, start of December. You know, so in a while. If your BMAT is not great, does that mean you have to perform, score better? Yes. So they do look at, I think some people misunderstand. They think, right, I've gotten to the interview. Now it's all just down to the interview. It's not. They're going to look at the interview. You're going to be scored for the interview. And then that's going to be combined with your score for the BMAT, your score for the your academic score as well, you know, your grades. So if your BMAT is a little low, then yes, you need your interview to help pull that back up. Equally, if your BMAT's really high and you've got and your interview goes terribly, that can pull you down. So, you know, what I always encourage students to do is to focus on what they can make a difference to. The BMAT has happened. You can't improve your score on that anymore. The interview you can. Cambridge interview a lot of their applicants. So even if BMAT is not quite what you wanted it to be, it's possible you still get asked to interview. Oxford interview fewer of their applicants. So it's the converse. If your BMAT is a little lower, that might have implications for whether or not you actually get shortlisted for interview. But yeah, you know, a stunning grades and stunning BMAT score could be undone by a car crash of an interview. It would have to be a pretty bad interview, but you know, just be aware that you asked those other things do carry over. Okay. Why do some students for medicine have more than 2 interviews? So the way that Oxford and Cambridge do it, and I'll sort of use Oxford as, or use my interview experience as an example. So I was interviewed at my main college, at the college that I applied to. I was also interviewed at Wadham, which was chosen, I think, at random. Everyone was given a second college to interview at. This is just for sort of interviews in general, not medicine specific. This is relevant to everything pretty much. Now, either one of those colleges could have said, we want to do another interview with you. You know, we want you to come back. And basically what we had was, and again, it's a bit different for those doing it online, but what we had was, I got there on day 1. There was a notice board in the junior common room which had all the timings for your interview. So I thought, okay, I've got an interview in the morning at Christchurch, got an interview in the afternoon at Wadham. And then it also says, I think on day 3, it says something along the lines of, if you haven't heard anything by midday, you can leave. And so if you had heard anything before midday, you know, they might say, oh, we need you for another interview. But if it's after midday, they've asked that you've done all the interviews you need to. Now, they don't always stick to this. One of my friends who did history was on the train home when he got an email saying you need to come back. And it was well after the time when they said they wouldn't, you know, you could go home. So, you know, I'd say, you know, don't be on red alert or anything like that. Don't be super anxious about it, but just be aware that you might get asked for another interview. But also the way that the interviews, you know, it's really down to the college and if they want to do multiple interviews. And if you do get asked for another interview, again, don't overinterpret it. Don't be like, the last 2 interviews must have been rubbish if they want to interview me again. Or don't interpret it as, I must be so good, they just want to, you know, interview me again. Basically, you just want to make sure if you do get asked for another interview, that interview goes as well as possible, right? Again, think about the things that you have control over, think about the things that you can make a difference to. And at that stage, it's the upcoming interview. Okay, Ed, you pick one more question that you want to answer. I will pick one more question that I want to answer. And what we can do is apologize to all those that didn't get answered. And either, you know, if you still have burning questions that you need answered, chat with us one-to-one, or come next week and hopefully you get some answers there. Ed, what's looking good to you?
Yes, I'm going to be pick the easiest one, Will. So, will a recording of the session be shared?
Classic. Every week it gets asked, and we need to answer it. Go ahead.
Of course, it's the most important question, if you ask me, Will. Yes. So essentially, what's going to happen is, you will all have received an email, which will, of course, contain the link to watch the recorded open day. If not, you will be able to access the recording via YouTube. If you just type in UniAdmissions and the particular open day which you're interested in watching, those will be available on there for you as well.
Yeah, and then there's loads of, we put all our open days up there, so it's worth having a browse through and seeing, if there's another thing that might be relevant to you in your application. I'm going to go for anonymous attendee has asked a very good question, as they always do. What tip would you give us? What helped you the most? Do you think that there's a specific reason why they chose you over the other candidates? So that's a good question. The main tip I would give people is make sure that the mock interviews you do are going to be like the real thing. My school offered to help with interviews. I studied experimental psychology at Oxford. I was basically definitely the first student to have gone to Oxford for psychology, at least for a very long time, if not ever. The school had, normally sent a few people up for PPE and for medicine, that kind of thing. So they knew a lot about that. They knew a lot less about psychology. I had 2 mock interviews given by school, which I was really grateful for. But after coming out of my Oxford interviews, I realized that my mock interviews were not really like, they didn't really, they prepared me for being in an interview setting, certainly, but they weren't exactly what Oxford ended up asking. So my main tip would be try and make sure whoever is giving you your mock interviews knows what they're doing. Ideally, they've been through this process, very ideally for the subject that you're wanting to do. And also ideally, they've been through it relatively recently. Interviews these days are different to how they were 20, 30 years ago. So, the fresher and the more relevant the experience of the person that's helping you, the better. In terms of, is there a specific reason why they chose you over the candidates? I don't know if I can go into that without becoming super egotistical. I don't know why they chose me. I guess they thought I was a good candidate. I wouldn't say that there was like one thing that I said, which was just spellbinding information, and they thought this guy's amazing. I just did as best as I could, and I liked my subject. I was interested in my subject. If anything, maybe that. And on that note, again, apologies to those whose questions haven't been answered. I hope you find your answers somewhere. And if not with us, went them from school or somewhere else. Well done again to everyone who did their Oxford admissions test this last week. They're tough exams. If you came out of it thinking, oh, I don't know how that went, I guarantee you everyone else feels that way. I certainly did. There are some nutters who walk out of it thinking that was easy. I don't understand those people, but it should have been a tough test. It should have challenged you. And best of luck for the interviews. Hopefully you come along to another open day, but if you don't, then I hope this has been helpful. And yeah, all the best. Hopefully you get some good news in January. Thanks a lot for coming along, Ed. Thanks for coming, everyone else. All the best and goodbye from me and Ed.